Hello again and welcome to Ricoh GR 101 episode 11, or to be more precise, episode 11.1. This could get quite long, so we're going to split it into a two-parter, and it's a good candidate for that because there are two ways to shoot in manual mode. So first off, we're going to start with partial manual. If we just take a quick look at the exposure triangle again here. This little smart drawing I did. Now, we looked at shutter speed priority in the last video. When you're running the camera in shutter speed priority, you control this part, the shutter speed, and the camera controls the ISO and the aperture to get a good exposure. You can then use exposure compensation, like on the back there. Move that up and down to kind of give these two values a nudge. So if you want to underexpose slightly or overexpose slightly, you can do that with exposure compensation without changing the shutter speed that you've set. Conversely, if you're shooting aperture priority, the camera will control the ISO or ISO, and it will also control the shutter speed. Now, the camera always seems to like to keep the ISO low, which is a good thing, and so it will adjust the shutter speed. Again, you can use exposure compensation on the back here if you want to nudge these two values so that you get the exposure you want while sticking to the aperture that you have decided upon. Okay, now in partial manual control, which is what we will look at first, we will control both the aperture and the shutter speed, and we will let the camera control the ISO. This is the easiest way to adopt manual shooting on the GR or on other cameras as well. This is the easiest way to get started, and it gives you good control over the shutter speed and the aperture. And you can still use exposure compensation, which will give you a little nudge up and down on the ISO. So let's take a look at that now, shall we? We're going to switch the camera on. It's still where we left off in the previous video in shutter speed priority, or TV, time value, as Ricoh call it. So now we're going to hold the nub down, which is the locking button, and we're going to change that camera on over to M for manual mode. Okay, now as you can see now, the camera has made some significant changes to the layout. So M tells us we're in manual mode over here, and right next to that, this kind of bold symbol means this back dial will now control the shutter speed. You can see it's displaying 1/40th of a second right now, just by my left thumb. And if I move the jog dial up, I increase the shutter speed. You can see the ISO value is going a bit bananas here because I have set a max limit of 3200, and the camera is remembering that in manual mode. So it won't go higher than that, and it's flashing it yellow, warning me that I might not get a good exposure if I stick with that. Next along, we have the dome shape there, which indicates this front dial, and this front dial controls the aperture now in manual mode. Now you can switch these two around in the customization menu. If you would rather have your aperture on the back part here on the adjustment dial and the shutter speed on the front, you can switch those. We'll take a look at that in a second. But the other change the camera has made to the configuration is that the rear dial now controls your exposure compensation. You can't have exposure compensation here when you have shutter speed there, so it's moved exposure compensation down to this rear dial. Now the camera will remember these settings in between shooting, no problem at all. In fact, if I just show you, I'll go back to shutter speed priority there, TV. Now you can see that exposure compensation has been moved back to this one. Okay, so it's no problem. So we'll go back to M now and take a look at that. Now the ISO setting is on auto. So this is what happens when you shoot partial manual. You get to control shutter speed at the back here, aperture at the front, and you can nudge the ISO value by changing your exposure compensation on the rear wheel here. Okay, and so when I say give it a nudge, it's not like changing the value, because as the scene changes, if I point this at a light source, what it's telling me is the ISO value will change constantly to get a good exposure, what the camera thinks is a good exposure. Then it will take notice of my exposure compensation settings over here, and it will adjust its guess at what a good exposure is and adapt that to the exposure value I've set with the exposure compensation. Okay, so that's a great way to shoot in manual mode if you're a beginner. Let the camera control the ISO, you control your aperture here, your shutter speed here, and if you want to nudge the exposure in one direction or another, you use the rear dial to set an exposure compensation. Now we'll just take a quick look at how to switch these dials, because one thing you might find, and I certainly do, I'm so used to having my aperture control here and having exposure compensation back here by my thumb on the adjustment jog dial. It takes a little bit of getting used to when you figure out that when you're shooting partial manual and this is your, or partial or full manual, that this has now become the shutter speed control, and that aperture and that this exposure compensation has been moved down to the rear dial. That can take a bit of getting used to, so you might want to spend a bit of time and some practice shots figuring out what works best for you. Aperture here or here, shutter speed here or here. So we just go in the menu here and go into the custom menu. Yeah, there it is. In the custom menu controls on page 2, you've got the M mode dial setting. When you go into that one there, this is where you get to switch these around. Okay, so standard custom 1 is aperture at the front, shutter speed at the back, and that's what it's working for me. Go down to custom 2 and it moves shutter speed to the front dial, aperture at the back dial. If it were me, I would say, what am I most likely to change while shooting in partial or full manual? And if that turns out to be aperture, I would have aperture here. If that turns out to be shutter speed, depending on the conditions, I would move shutter speed here, so that I keep my finger here, and this is the one that is controlling the changes I'd like to make. Okay, so that is partial manual control. Aperture, shutter speed, exposure compensation, and automatic ISO. If you don't want to stick to previous automatic ISO settings, we can go up to the camera shooting mode there. On page 2 here we have ISO setting. It's still on auto. Go into that one, and if you want, you can change your upper value there. So if you'd like that to be higher, say 6400, you can do that there. It will ignore, it won't go higher than that, but because you're now running in manual control and you are controlling your shutter speed, it will ignore this minimum shutter speed setting down here. Let's just check that out. So we're at a high aperture value here, f11, screen is very dark, and I should be able to go down way past 1/10 of a second, and you can see down there now, we're now shooting at 2 seconds. Okay, so it will ignore that minimum shutter speed setting if you do that. Okay, that's it for now. End of part 1. Part 2 coming up, episode 11.2, full manual control, and we will see how that affects the screen display and the controls of the camera. Okay, see you in the next one.